So I had an interesting question the other day, and that was this one. Why is it that you can almost instantly tell whether you're listening to a good guitarist or not? What's the difference between a good guitarist and an average guitarist? And to me, the difference really is not so much in the notes that they play, but in how they play the notes. Whether they can make the guitar sing or not, whether they can inject that emotion into their playing or not. Now, from a technique point of view, there are probably 3 techniques that you really need to have a good handle on in order to make the guitar sing properly. And they are slides, bends and vibrato. Now there are plenty of other techniques that you can bring to bear as well, but if you've got control of those 3, then I think you've got all of the rudiments that you need to really put some emotion into your playing. So what I thought I'd do this week is just break down these 3 techniques and put some focus on each of them and show you how I go about approaching each of these techniques. So let's start with slides. So I make a distinction between what I call specific slides and indeterminate slides. And a specific slide is basically a move between 2 notes. So it's got a defined start and an end point. And it's a great way of changing positions as well. So a great way of practicing this is to work around, say, the blues scale or the pentatonic. And see if you can just slide around between 2 positions or 3. Just see if you can find your way around the neck using slides. So that's a specific slide. Now an indeterminate slide is basically a slide that doesn't really have a fixed end point. And I use it mostly like this. So let's say I'm playing a phrase and then I'll finish the phrase off with a slide. And it's kind of like a full stop, it ends that phrase. And I kind of imagine it's a bit like breathing out, or it's like sighing, especially the downward slide. You can hear that? And you can also use them going upwards as well. And an upward slide, again, it finishes a phrase, but it kind of keeps the energy. And the other thing it does is it kind of acts as a preface. If you want to move from, say, lower down the neck up to higher up, it kind of gives that hint that that's exactly what you're about to do. You hear that? So that's how I'd use indeterminate slides. So string bends then, how do I use those? So with bends, I tend to use what I call the rock grip or the handshake grip. And it's where you hold the neck between your thumb and your index finger like that, so it's just caught there. And what that does is it gives you a hinge point, which is on your index finger just there, and you can use that to control the bends with. Now I've talked about the difference between the rock grip and the classical thumb behind the neck, the pinch grip as well in previous videos. So go and check those out if you're interested in the difference between the two and why I use one and not the other, and why I move between the two. But anyway, for bends, I find if I'm in with this kind of hand position, then I've got much more control over the string. And when I bend a string, I'll put a few fingers behind it if I can. So the finger in control of the note is my third finger, but I've actually got my second and my first finger on that same string as well. And that gives me the strength to be able to bend that string as well. And obviously you can bend between any two notes. It just depends whether you've got the finger strength to do it and making sure you don't break the strings, obviously. And the hardest thing really for string bends, bending up, is intonation. and making sure you actually land on the note that you're aiming for and you're not sharp or flat. And the hardest thing there is actually to get the right amount of tension, because the tension you need is dependent on the string gauge that you use, it's dependent on the scale length of the guitar, and it's dependent on the tuning of the guitar as well. So, for example, I often miss bends because I'm moving guitars between a guitar that's tuned to standard concert pitch like this one and a guitar tuned down the semitone. I often play gigs with a guitar tuned down the semitone, and that changes the tension in the strings, and that changes the amount of pressure that I need in order to achieve that bend. So it's something I constantly have to work with. But there is a cheat actually. If you can bend and add a little bit of vibrato, you can use that vibrato to pull yourself in, get the intonation right. So that's one trick I often do, and we'll talk about vibrato in a moment. But the two classic ways of using string bending is to bend up to a note and then pre-bend and relax. And there's another bend as well. A bend and a release. It's another classic phrase to do. And the other thing you find if you're playing around in the blues, you've got this sort of between the flat third, which is there, and the sharp third. You've got that kind of sound. And you can actually take advantage of that with a little sort of a quarter bend, just a hint of a bend. You may have heard that before. And the other place you can use that is between the fourth, you've got the flat 5, which people call the blues note, and the 5. So you can do a little sort of quarter bender on that fourth as well. So that's using quarter bend from just between 4 and flat 5. Quarter bend up from flat 3 to 3. And then down to root. You can get those really sort of nice little bluesy bends, just a little quarter note in there. The other way of using bends is to use bends in conjunction with other strings as well, and that gives you this kind of pedal steel sound. And really what I'm doing there is I'm thinking about the chord, so I'm aiming for that bar E chord up there, and I put my little finger across the top 2 strings there, and that's on the second below. I'm bending that up a whole tone, but I'm keeping my little finger there. And the other classic one is just here. So 12th and 12th, and I'm bending that B string up to the 14th and keeping that other string ringing as well. And another classic effect is bending up to a unison, so that's the note I'm aiming for. I'm starting there and I'm playing both notes. So that's a classic effect, especially if you've got some distortion going. And then finally onto the technique which for me really makes the guitar sing, and that's vibrato. So there are 2 classic ways of playing vibrato, and they're based on 2 different movements. One is sort of a transverse movement where you're moving the string to the side. You're doing sort of small string bends like that. So that's the transverse vibrato, and you can do this either by pushing the string, so what you're doing is you're pushing it away from yourself and relaxing. And the other thing you can do is to pull it towards you, pull your hand down. And again the movement's the same, you're pulling it down and then you're relaxing. So that's transverse vibrato. The other way is longitudinal. And what you're doing there is that you're basically moving along the length of the string. You're moving your hand along the length of the string. And what that does is, if you imagine the string, it's kind of stretching the string. When you're pulling that way, you're adding tension to the string. When you're pulling that way, you're kind of releasing some of the tension in the string. And this tends to sound better on something like a classical guitar. On the classical guitar, you tend to use this kind of longitudinal vibrato. And on the electric guitar, you tend to use transverse vibrato. And then for me, the magic really happens when you start putting all of this together and you're able to sort of intermix one technique with another. Let me see if I can demonstrate what I mean. Okay, so once you start combining these techniques, that's where you really start to make the guitar sing. So start to play around with it. Let's say a slide followed by just vibrato. Okay, or a string bend with vibrato. Yeah, and actually that's what I call the Whitney Houston effect is a string bend and then hold it steady for a moment and then add the vibrato afterwards. I call it that because one of the standout things I remember from hearing Whitney Houston sing is when she sang that final money note. That's exactly what she'd do. She'd hit that high note, she'd hold it for a second or two, and then she'd introduce a vibrato afterwards. And I stole that idea and started using it in my guitar solos. So, the Whitney Houston effect. And obviously you can do things like, I don't know, sort of using slides and bends. So what am I doing there? I'm doing a bend to that note and then sliding it. So that's it. Hopefully that was useful for you. These three techniques really are worth working on and getting under your hands, being able to use them without thinking about them. Because these three techniques just on their own will allow you to inject so much more emotion to your playing than you could do if all you're doing is just playing the notes. Anyway, have a go at them, see how you get on, and we'll chat next time. Goodbye.